name's Rachel Browner, and I am the program coordinator for OneOp, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session on military children's family relationship. In case you're joining us for the first time, I'd like to give you a brief tour of our webinar platform so you can find your way around. Hopefully, you're currently able to view the slides we're sharing. If you're unable to see them or if you have any other difficulties, please email us at contact@oneop.org for tech support. Also, to embed the chat pod so you don't miss any links or conversations, simply place your cursor over the shared slides. You will then see a toolbar pop up across the bottom of your screen, and from there, just click the chat bubble icon. When typing questions or comments, please be sure to select everyone from the response options drop-down menu so everyone's able to view them in the chat. At this time, if you're open to it, feel free to go ahead and type in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. It makes this platform a little bit more personable, helps us to get to know you, get an idea of maybe what organization or location that you're from. And please note that the slides and resources are available for download on the event page for today's session. We will be covering continuing education information at the end of the webinar, so please stay tuned at the end if you're interested in continuing education credits or certificate of attendance. And then finally, closed captioning is available for this webinar, and you can turn on the subtitles via the Zoom toolbar. Thank you for joining us as we continue our partnership with the Department of Defense and the U.S. Department of Agriculture to expand the readiness, knowledge, and networks of the professionals supporting our military service members and their families. The views expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the official policy of the Department of Defense, U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Government, or OneOp, and the mention of any entity or product is for informational purposes only. I'd like to go ahead at this time and introduce our panel of presenters for today. We have three very highly qualified presenters that we're excited to participate in today's presentation. Dr. Shelley McDermott Wadsworth is a distinguished professor of human development and family science at Purdue University, where she directs the Military Family Research Institute, which she co-founded and serves as Director Emerita of the Center for Families. Dr. McDermott Wadsworth holds an MBA in Management and MS and PhD degrees in Human Development and Family Studies from the Pennsylvania State University. Her primary research interest is the relationship between work conditions and family life, with special focus on military families. And she's authored over 140 articles and chapters, and her research has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, Veterans Affairs and Agriculture, state governments, and numerous private philanthropies. She served on federal advisory committees for the National Academies of Science and the Department of Defense and has testified in Congress on multiple occasions regarding military and veteran families. Dr. Sean Whiteman is an interim dean of the Emma Eccles Jones College of Education and Human Services and professor of Human Development and Family Studies at Utah State University. He's received his BA, an MA, and his degrees in psychology and his PhD in Human Development and Family Studies from the Pennsylvania State University. After spending the first 11 years of his career in the Department of Human Development and Family Studies at Purdue University, he joined the faculty at Utah State University in 2016. Broadly, Dr. Whiteman conducts research on the connections between family socialization processes and youth's health and social emotional adjustment. He's specifically interested in how siblings direct and indirectly act as sources of social influence and social comparison with families, and how those families' experiences foster similarities and differences in their relationship qualities, attributes, and health-related behaviors. Dr. Leanne Knobloch is a professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois and co-chair of the Science Advisory Board of the Military Child Education Coalition. Her research examines how military families communicate across the deployment cycle, and her scholarship has been honored by the Golden Anniversary Monograph Award from the National Communication Association and the Biennial Article Award from the International Association for Relationship Research. Her research on military and veteran families has been funded by the U.S. Department of Defense and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Institute. At this time, I'd like to go ahead and pass over the presenter reins to Dr. Shelley McDermott Wadsworth. And Dr. Wadsworth, you might be on mute at the moment. Dr. Wadsworth, I think we are having a little bit of an audio issue because it looks like your mic is muted.
I'm so sorry. My computer locked up for a minute. My apologies. Can everyone hear? Can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay.
Thank you.
Phew, what a relief. I was sitting there terrified because I couldn't figure out what to do. It's lovely to be here today with you all. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think I speak on behalf of all of the presenters, and I've really enjoyed seeing in the chat where everyone is joining from. It's a real honor to have the opportunity to talk with you today, and my hope is that I can learn as much or more than you, because I really value the experience that you have on the front lines. I only hope that the things that we've prepared to share with you are useful to you in your work. The learning objectives we developed for today are to review, as you can see here, the history of the relationship between the U.S. military and its families, to discuss the demographics, the current demographics of children in military families, to understand the challenges and resilience that children in military families demonstrate, and identify how deployments and other aspects of military service shape children's adjustment directly or indirectly. So I'd like to begin by inviting you to share with us some of the relationship challenges that you've found that military children experience that civilians and adults may overlook. There's always more going on with kids than some of the rest of us know. So I'm really curious to learn about what you have seen in your work. So please contribute to the chat about that. And I'm going to wait just a minute, and then I'll move on and try to integrate some of those ideas into our discussion. Anybody got some things to share? Oh, good. Yes, frequent PCS and a difficulty of adjustment. We talk a lot about deployments, but of course, they're only one of the major aspects of military service that affects children. Developing trust with new caregivers, especially given all of the transitions. Another really big issue. Childcare, huge challenge. Dealing with peers and parents' military service, another big issue. Indiana, where I am, is a National Guard state. This is a very big issue for National Guard kids. Neighborhood transitions, military folks often comment that they aren't able to afford to live in neighborhoods that they think are safe or have other characteristics that they desire. And so they worry about their kids' welfare. So keep the ideas coming. But yes, these are the kinds of things that we hear a lot in our work. And this resonates. And science has also paid attention to these same issues. But let's talk a little bit about the history. You probably are aware that families really have been part of the U.S. military from the very beginning. uh, even in the Revolutionary War, um, spouses followed soldiers to war. They served. Women disguised themselves so they could serve, as well as serving roles as nurses and cooks and so on. Um, for a long time, that involvement was informal. It wasn't formally recognized in any way. And until 1942, remember, we had a draft at that time. Men with wives or children were not allowed to enlist during peacetime. They could be drafted during wartime, but exceptions were made, and officers in particular had greater latitude on this point. Um, Recognition of the financial needs of women, widows, and children was recognized quite early in relation to wounded or killed veterans since the 1600s. But those are folks who had completed their military service or ended their military service because they died or were wounded. Financial support for families during military service started for the first time in 1898. World War II was a turning point because heads of households were drafted, and so provisions had to be made for families who were left at home during the war. And there were many innovations during this time that you can still see today. Childcare, for example, non-parental care really expanded during this time. And even the school lunch program was influenced by the war and by the military need to ensure that it had well-nourished prospective recruits. After the Korean War, retention of service members fell in part due to family concerns. Even though only about a third of service members were married, but by 1960, spouses and children outnumbered service members in the military population, and that continues today. 1965, the Army led the way by developing community service centers, and the other branches gradually followed. Today, the U.S. military runs the largest employer-provided child development system in the United States, and in many ways shows the civilian community how it can be done, because a very large proportion of those centers, all of them virtually, are accredited, for example. And many hundreds now are using a science-based curriculum that was developed by colleagues at Purdue, I'm happy to report. You may have heard of it. It's called Early Learning Matters. Now, the world changed quite a lot when the draft ended in 1973, and ever since we've had an all-volunteer force. So the military has to compete with civilian employers to attract service members, and that changed the way that military service played out over time. So people serve longer now, and the percent of service members with family members increased. But we also saw an increase in single parent families. People still could not join when they were single parents, but with rising divorce, people become single parents during service, and they're no longer asked to leave because of that, or at least they haven't been. I don't know if that is going to change. Regulations preventing service by married women and mothers ended in 1975. And the proportion of female personnel then rose from 2.5%, where it had been restricted to 11% in 1991. And now it's almost up to 20%. And you will recall in 2015, the combat exclusion rule was lifted so that women are no longer prohibited by regulation from serving in combat units, which opens up career opportunities for them. But of course, the rules of eligibility for those units have recently changed, and we don't know what that will mean. So the number of dual military families also has increased quite a bit. And all of those things affect children's experiences of military service and who's around them when they serve. So I'd like to invite comments again from your own experience. So as you engage with military families today, what are the things that parents and kids are talking to you about? What's on their minds about things that are happening in the world that concern them? I'm imagining the shutdown is a big topic of conversation these days. What other things are you hearing about? I've heard a story in the news lately that talks about how more and more schools and more states are restricting kids' access to social media during the day. Um, Here's a comment I see about worry about how they're going to get food and plan for the holidays. Yes, it's a very stressful time when people aren't sure if they'll be paid or if the programs that support them will be available to them. Uh, uh, in the holidays that, we don't know how long the shutdown will last and if there are delays in pay or program operation, how long those will last. So it is a time of great uncertainty, I'm sure, for all of you on the call, as well as for the families that you serve. Special education support, yes. Except families with members with exceptional needs is always a big topic of conversation, and particularly in relation to relocations, military families are always deeply concerned about how they're going to maintain continuity for family members who have special needs. Some issues are always there. Kids are always thinking a lot about peers and learning a lot about relationships. And then some issues are kind of changing their shape every day. Which social media platform is preeminent? I'm sure lots of us are scratching our heads about what AI is going to mean for the world and for how kids study. And yeah, so keep the comments coming. I think that's great. But I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague, Sean.
It's great to be with you today, so thank you for joining us. And as Shelley alluded to during her initial presentation, we want to talk a little bit about the demographics of military families today and how they may have shifted over the last half a century from when we had a draft to an all-volunteer force. And as we look at the demographics of families today, about 47%, so a little less than half of our military workforce are single with no children, whereas 30% or nearly 31% are married with children. Today, there are more family members. There's 2.4 million family members, including spouses, adult children, and adult dependents, compared to a little over 2 million service members. And so we think about our population is our military demographics and active duty and select reserve populations. There are literally more family members than there are service members. Of the military personnel, about 30% are married, 13% are married without children, and 5.8% are single without children. Yet almost 2/3 of the DoD family members are children, and about 1/3 are spouses. So when we think about those family members, we're dealing with 1.5 million children that are in military families. And when we think about the demographics of those, among military personnel, 36.7% have children under the age of 22. And so the majority, although the majority of military personnel without children is about 63%, about 37% have children. And most of those families have more than one child. When we think about the demographics of those families, the children in the active duty workforce are relatively young. Uh, you can think about almost 70% being under the age of 11, compared to about 25 to 30% having adolescent or young adult offspring. So one way to think about this is that nearly 70% of children in military families are pre-adolescent. There are fewer DoD active duty members than their associated family members, as we described earlier. And the children are generally younger in age, as we see again here. Active duty members who have children have an average of 2.0. So they have two children per family, and that's actually higher than the birth rate in the general population. While active duty members who have dependents average 2.3, so there can be additional dependents that occur within families. When we think about select reserve populations, the age distribution's a little different. There are fewer DoD and DHS select reserve members than their associated family members. That's true, as we saw before. Of the select reserve members, 30% are married with children and 8.6% are single. But we see greater balance in the age distributions of our reserve population, whereas we have equal proportions of early childhood, middle childhood, adolescent, and then young adult being a little less, versus our active duty population. And so we see that across these different demographics, families are important and prevalent. There's more family members in both our active duty and our select reserve populations than there are personnel. The children vary in age across those two populations, but skew towards the younger side overall. So children in military families tend to be in early childhood and middle childhood, with a slight difference in reserve populations. And we see an evolution since we've moved to a volunteer workforce or military force over the last 40 or 50 years. And so when you think about the actual families behind these statistics, what stands out to you as most important to your work or your experiences? Please share with us in the chat how military families have evolved, and where do you feel there's gaps or opportunities for supporting military families? And we can think about this, or service members are getting married at a younger age and having children sooner. Parent separation is a heavy burden on the family. Yeah, and when we think about, we'll talk about this in a little bit, when parent separation happens and children are younger in age, what are the implications of that separation for both the at-home parent as well as the child? It's hard parenting small children from afar, and new parent support is often overworked. So yeah, when we think about children being younger and military deployments and separations occurring, what are those implications again? The statistics show young families. That's absolutely correct. That this statistics our military families are younger, both in age of children, perhaps in marital years. So these are things that we have to think about, the timing and its impact of separations, of moves, of changes in schools and other transitions. Most recent comment, I see it active in a variety of supports in our elementary schools, less intentional in our high schools. And that may be something that we have to think about for those who have adolescents. Where do we intervene or provide additional supports? And childcare is a huge concern amongst this population as well as the general population. How do we provide affordable childcare? How do we provide breaks? These are all areas in which we may need to think about policies and procedures. And you'll see that some of our work will consider some of these factors. So thank you for those comments. And we have to consider always the populations that we're dealing with and how their characteristics will impact the opportunities and programs that we provide. At this point, I will turn the presentation over to my colleague Leanne, who will talk to us a little bit more.
Hi, everybody. It's so great to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to join in this conversation, share some research and ideas with you. And I'm really enlivened by the activity I'm seeing in the chat. That is fantastic. And we really encourage you to keep up that active participation. Shelley and Sean so far have discussed the history of military policies for military families and the demographics of military children and families. Right now, we're going to shift gears a little bit to dive into what the research says about the opportunities and the obstacles that military children face. So my segment is going to be all about research on military children. And before we dive into the particulars, we would like to start with a pre-quiz. I'd like you to just grab your phone or your notes and jot down your best guess on a piece of scrap paper for what you think the answers are to these true false questions. And these are actually going to be things we're going to learn over the next couple of minutes. But we thought it might be engaging to give some guesses in advance. So here are 4 true false questions. We'd love for you to jot your best guess answer in the margin of your notes. The first one is, children from military families have higher rates of adjustment problems than children from community samples. True or false? Second one, children from military families demonstrate poor adjustment because of more authoritarian military discipline. True or false? Third question, children from military families generally show positive growth following a parent's deployment. Is your best guess true or false? And then finally, children from military families, the quality of the at-home parents' parenting is what determines child adjustment during deployment. So is it the at-home parents' parenting that matters? True or false? Great, I see lots of activity in the chat as well. Let's jump into the research to see what the answers are. The earliest research on the effects of military service on children was conducted during World War II. And this work considered the challenges of being separated from a parent during deployment, as well as the impact of exposures to bombings and evacuations in Britain. And of course, you might guess this, most studies focused on negative outcomes, of course, but multiple researchers commented on the resilience of military children. For example, Bodeman in 1941 commented about the extraordinary toughness and the flexibility of military children. And so this initial research found that the diversity of children's reactions to fathers' deployments really encouraged them to pay more attention to the circumstances surrounding separations. So because those outcomes were not uniform, the question became, well, why? Why is it that the outcomes are diverse for military children? As research continued into the 1970s and 1980s, a pretty big scholarly debate sprung up about the influence of military parents' service on children's development. So, on one side of the debate were Legrone and others who proposed the notion of military family syndrome. What is military family syndrome? Well, this idea suggests that children in military families have more behavior disorders compared to children in civilian families, possibly due to overly authoritarianism in military discipline, as well as frequent relocations, and separation. So the military family syndrome is the idea that children have more behavior disorders because of the authoritarian discipline they're experiencing in their families, as well as frequent relocations and separations. That's one side of the debate. On the other side of the debate was Jensen, an Army physician and eventual leader at the NIH, and others who pointed to multiple studies showing that military children fared as well or better than children in the civilian community. Okay, so the first large-scale study of military youth was conducted by Orthner in 1987. And it compared adolescent children of Air Force members with civilian youth who were attending the same school. So the comparison point here was really good. And their data showed no evidence of more difficulties among military adolescents than their civilian counterparts. So again, this study was adolescent children of Air Force members comparing to civilian youth who were attending the exact same schools. And findings like this is really important for reshaping the narrative that military family well-being is compromised relative to civilian families, right? So findings like this suggest no, military family well-being is not compromised relative to civilian families. Again, moving forward in time, we're zipping ahead to the 2000s, research on military children and families. Now that we have a bit of historical background on the research literature, let's turn our attention to more contemporary findings. The past 20 years or so of research has emphasized how deployments are related to the health and functioning of spouses and children at home. Deployments since 9/11, of course, have become more frequent and also longer in duration. So it's very critical to understand the implications for military children, not just for researchers to understand the implications, but also so that researchers can transform that knowledge to the work that you yourselves are doing, but also to military command, right, and military policymakers and legislators. So it's important to understand that researchers sometimes treat deployment as singular and static events, but obviously deployments are actually a series of transitions occurring in at least 3 stages. So the simplest way of thinking about the deployment cycle is that it begins with pre-deployment, when service members receive orders to deploy. And I can tell you that studies of pre-deployment are pretty limited. Not a ton of research focuses on this time, but the data emphasize stress, preparation, and strong emotion. So let's unpack that a little bit. According to the emotional cycle of deployment model by Pincus and colleagues, military families may oscillate between feelings of loss and feelings of denial about the separation. Family members may work to get things like insurance and financial affairs in order, but they're also trying to squeeze in family time together. So there's a lot to pack in. In addition, service members may have longer work hours, right? They're training for the deployment, and that can add stress to an already stressful time. The deployment phase itself requires all members of military families to adjust to the separation, to cope with their feelings, and to navigate changing roles and responsibilities. The bulk of research on military families focuses on this phase of the deployment cycle, typically with cross-sectional or retrospective research design. So families are asked to either provide a report at one shot in time or to reflect back on their experiences of deployment after it's over. Typical reactions for at-home partners during the deployment stage include distress, worry, and obviously feeling overwhelmed with household and parenting responsibilities. Commonly endorsed stressors include parenting duties on top of the need to support a child or children who are adjusting to being separated from the parent. Now, home front parents may struggle with a lack of respite and time to take care of their own health and well-being, right? There's so little time for them to get everything they need to get done when they're adopting that dual parent mode. Also, maybe they're working, maybe they're supporting elderly family members, they're taking care of their children. And the research suggests that both parents during this stage need to cultivate other support networks. Shelley was involved in a study about this. So the service member deployed might be cultivating social support from unit buddies. The family members at home might be cultivating support from extended family members, friends, neighbors, or coworkers. Finally, the deployment cycle ends with reunion and reintegration when service members return and reintegrate back into domestic life. And this can be a time of some ambivalence. On one hand, of course, there's lots of joy, there's lots of relief, the service member is home, but there's also the stress of renegotiating family roles and routines. Service members may find themselves being transported from the mission to the family kitchen in less than 72 hours. This is rapid, right? This is really quick. So that rapid return and immersion into life back home can be quite challenging. Parents and children may misinterpret the here but not here quality of interactions. Service members, for their part, may feel unsure how to reconnect after the separation. Maybe they're surprised at how much the children have grown while they've been gone. Maybe they feel hurt if the children are slow to warm up. Maybe they take a step back and even wonder, does the family still need him or her because they have these new routines in place? Family members at home might wonder how to reintegrate the service member into their daily routines. Where does this person fit now? Back into a new normal that the family has already established. Some research finds evidence of a honeymoon phase where excitement is prominent at first, but then everyday strains and struggles start to set in. And I found this in my own work as well. In fact, we make a recommendation that services for military families might be more relevant after the first month or two when the honeymoon period is over, and then those everyday stressors and strains start to come in. So in short, here the research shows that each phase of the deployment cycle has its own challenges, and it's really important for clinicians and military family health professionals to be aware of those challenges to be able to best serve military families. And then comes the million-dollar question, right? How does deployment affect the well-being of children? In some ways, this is really the crucial question, the one that researchers have been spending decades of time and effort trying to understand. And so what I'd like to do in the next couple of minutes is to give you a flavor for the kinds of massive, truly massive data collection efforts that have been conducted to examine this issue. Large-scale studies show us that parental deployment offers youth both opportunities for growth as well as challenges to overcome. Okay, so it's both opportunities for growth and challenges. For example, children may grow in independence and autonomy by taking on additional household responsibilities, right? Children have to grow up fast because there's more things that they need to do around the house in the service member's absence. The DoD-wide Millennium Cohort Family Study, a huge study currently being conducted by the Naval Health Research Center, found that most parents report their children were functioning very well at baseline, but parental deployment with combat exposure corresponded with clinical diagnoses of ADHD and depression. Parents were more likely to report depression among children in deployed families than non-deployed families. Okay, so there is a sense of resilience. Children are functioning well, but deployment with combat exposure is particularly challenging for children. The RAND Deployment Life Study followed families from all service branches across the deployment cycle. This study further confirmed the overall resilience of military families. So that's another big study that earmarks the overall resilience of military families as an important takeaway. But it also found some elevated psychological symptoms among younger children during deployment, and also strained relationships with the deployed parent among teens after reintegration. Okay, so some particular struggles with teens upon reintegration and some elevated psychological symptoms among younger children during deployment itself. Interestingly, a protective finding was that teens appear to benefit significantly from interacting with other military peers during deployment. So this finding underscores the importance of getting those military teens connected with their peers during deployment so that they have some shared ground and common experiences with their peers to talk about and have some social support from. Studies utilizing probability and community-based samples, including several state-level youth health surveys, shed light on the risk and resilience of youth experiencing parental separation for various reasons. And here we'd like to call your attention to data from the very large Indiana Youth Survey as an example, which compared parental separation due to deployment to parental separation from incarceration. The findings showed that either kind of parent separation corresponds with negative health and behavior outcomes for children, right? So being separated from a parent corresponds with negative health and behavior outcomes. But youth who experience a parental separation because of military deployment had a relatively small increase in risk relative to youth who were not separated from their parents. Okay, so a little bit more risk, not a lot compared to youth who are not separated. But those who were separated due to parental incarceration had approximately double the risk compared to youth experiencing no separation. A small percentage in this study, about 3% of youth, experienced both types of parental separation, and these youth had the most elevated risk. The probability of considering suicide increased from 0.13 to 0.33 on a scale of 0 to 1. And the number of school days skipped increased from 0.34 days to 0.74 days per month. What do these findings tell us? Well, they tell us that parental separation is challenging. Parental separation because of military deployment is slightly more challenging than no separation. Parental separation due to incarceration or both incarceration and military deployment is really challenging for youth. And so these findings highlight the importance of understanding the larger context in which military families are embedded, right? Because they're not all the same, and they come to military deployment and military family life with different backgrounds, issues, and concerns. All right, at this point, I will turn it back over to Sean to give you more findings.
Thanks, Leanne. One of the things that we notice in the work that Leanne just presented is that military deployments, especially combat deployments, are associated with differences in children's outcomes, including some of their behavioral and mental health outcomes. And although we've established that deployments may matter, the mechanisms by which they connect to youth well-being are not as clear. And so research in the past 20 years has increased its focus on the mechanisms that undergird these associations. Particularly research investigating the associations between military deployments and children's mental health and well-being reveal both direct and indirect effects. For example, separation from a deployed parent may have direct effects on children's relationships and adjustments through disrupted attachment relationships with the deployed parent. For example, Berry and Berry in 2009 found that young children with a deployed parent showed increased behavior problems during that deployment and more secure attachment behaviors such as anxiety, needing attention, and clinginess at reunion than children whose parents had not experienced a recent deployment. Parents reported that children seemed confused and distressed by the sudden reappearance of a parent, although this did not seem permanent, reflecting those different stages of deployment. Importantly, children's insecure attachment behaviors are often linked with other problems, including anxiety, difficult social relationships, and disrupted emotion regulation. Furthermore, following a parent's deployment, youth may experience feelings of uncertainty, confusion, and loss, which may impede successful development. Youth responses, however, may also differ as a function of age and existing bonds with parents. Adolescents may have more experience with a parent's deployment and may be able to adapt to changes. So as we think about the populations that we work with and the ages of the children, there may be different outcomes. Given the knowledge of the dangers associated with military deployments to active war zones, feelings of ambiguous loss may be especially likely, however, amongst adolescents that have the cognitive capacity and ability to understand the dangers that their parent may be at. And so we have to consider both the nature of the deployment, but also how that affects the relationships that those children have with both the deployed and non-deployed parent. In fact, recent research suggests that the separation from a deployed parent may have direct effects on children's well-being and adjustments, but systems-oriented work reveals that parents' military deployments are related to children's adjustment through the non-deployed parent's mental health. As Leanne acknowledged, during deployment, at-home parents cope with their feelings, worries, distress, navigate increased parenting demands and household responsibilities, and help their children adjust to the separation from the service member. At-home parents themselves may experience increases in depression, anxiety, and sleep difficulties. And the literature on mental health, and in particular depression and parenting in non-military samples, highlights consistent links between depression and maladaptive parenting behaviors, including increased negative rearing and less frequent positive parenting behaviors. So the non-deployed parent's mental health can be related to their own ability and capacity to parent their children. Consistent with the literature on civilian families, research with military families reveals that at-home parents' mental health during deployment is directly associated with their children's adjustment. In addition to influencing at-home parents' mental health, deployment may also shape at-home parents' parenting procedures, how they approach and rear their children. A study of Army spouses with a service member deployed discovered that at-home parents were at risk for high-stress parenting, which in turn was related to increased psychosocial morbidity amongst their school-age children. Deployment of a spouse is linked to less sensitive parenting as well. During a separation, children look to their at-home parents for comfort and reassurance and support, yet that parent may not have the same capacity to do so that they did before the deployment. Parental responsiveness can also dampen the adverse effects of events on children, so that to the extent that parents are able to cope and handle the stresses that they face and be more responsive, they may be able to mitigate some of these more challenging effects. With respect to responsiveness, however, results from a recent longitudinal study of National Guard families across the entire deployment cycle, so from pre-deployment to reintegration, found that parental responsiveness on the part of the parents declined over the course or the cycle of deployment. In fact, at-home parents' responsiveness continued to decline during reintegration, and in turn was linked with increases in externalizing amongst their children. Importantly, these linkages between parental responsiveness Um, and youth behaviors were found after controlling for changes in at-home parents' depressive symptoms. So this was not a function of the parents' own mental health challenge. It was a function of their decreased responsiveness. Given these connections, intervention programs focused on parental efficacy and quality time may be especially important for promising for promoting resilience amongst children in military families. Indeed, recent work with military parents revealed that parenting interventions strengthen both maternal and paternal self-efficacy, leading to positive gains in youth parental adjustment. In fact, in a recent study, this one here that's on the slides, and not to be too technical with statistics, but we tried to disentangle the connections between at-home parents' mental health and parenting challenges and children's adjustment. With a sample of 114 National Guard families followed across the deployment cycle, we found that at-home parents' parental responsiveness declined linearly from pre-deployment through deployment. So here's this linear time, this decrease in responsiveness, and continued to decline into reintegration, which surprised us to an extent. Parents' depressive symptoms similarly increased across the deployment cycle, but came back down. What this quadratic effect reveals is that leveled off following the return of their deployed service members. Importantly, at-home parents' responsiveness was linked to increases in externalizing behaviors amongst children. So as responsiveness declined, externalizing behaviors increased amongst their children. And these linkages between parental responsiveness and youth behaviors were net of parents' change in depressive symptoms. So it wasn't a function of them becoming more depressed, but in turn, it was a function of their change in responsiveness. Again, given these connections, intervention programs focused on parental efficacy and quality may be especially important for promoting resilience amongst children. And I apologize for not switching to this slide. This is the slide that shows that responsiveness was the factor that shaped children's internalizing and externalizing behaviors. The influence of deployment on parental stress and parenting style clearly has important implications for children's well-being. And one area of particular concern has been the risk for child maltreatment. This has been a major area of study. In fact, deployment has been studied more than any other service-specific factor for risk of child maltreatment in military populations. There is some evidence that parental deployment increases risk for child maltreatment. For example, a study of military families from all branches of service living in Texas between 2000 and 2003 substantiated cases of child maltreatment increased 30% for each 1% increase in active duty personnel departing for deployment. Similarly, in a study of Army families with at least one prior substantiated case of child maltreatment, overall rates of maltreatment in families experiencing deployment were 42% higher compared to periods of non-deployment, and rates of abuse specifically by female civilian spouses tripled during deployment. As with any area of study, however, not all analyses of deployed and child maltreatment have produced consistent results, and the influence of deployment on this outcome is likely complex. In particular, some evidence suggests that only certain types of child maltreatment or more severe cases increase during periods of war, and there may be even reductions in risk for certain types of maltreatment. For instance, a study of deploying Air Force personnel found increases in more severe child neglect and sexual abuse, but reductions in less severe forms of abuse such as emotional abuse or mild neglect. Mixed results regarding child maltreatment may be influenced by the fact that different subgroups of the military population may respond differently to the stress of deployment. For example, parent populations with more pre-existing factors or fewer supports and resources may be more likely to exhibit increased risk for more severe perpetration, particularly in response to deployment-related stressors. Conversely, more resilient subgroups may actually experience stress-related growth in response to deployment. And some have theorized that this may contribute to reductions in risk and less severe forms of maltreatment. Further, the impact of deployment and the timing of greatest risk are likely different amongst the deploying versus the at-home parent. So although maltreatment is a clear area of study, the opportunities and challenges may differ as a function of existing supports and challenges. Another area in which we've seen a great deal of work is in the study of interparental conflict, that is between spouses or partners. Although the military deployment of a spouse or partner is clearly linked to the mental health and parenting behaviors of at-home parents, in turn the children's youth and in turn the youth's adjustment, parental deployments also shape parenting dynamics. For example, a recent study of 238 active duty military families during the period of reintegration, interparental conflict was linked to youth mental health and adjustment above and beyond the influence of parent-child relationships and youth's perception of the family conflict. So we see here consistent results and links between parents' conflicts between each other or with each other and their children's well-being across anxiety, depression, self-efficacy, and personal well-being. Specifically, interparental conflict was positively related or related to more depressive symptoms and anxiety amongst youth. And as parental conflict increased or interparental conflict increased, it was linked to less youth self-efficacy and personal well-being. These findings are consistent with the larger literature on interparental conflict and child adjustment among non-military samples. So it demonstrates the impact of important family processes, not directly involving the children, but those that they observe. Another important family system that has generally been ignored on the work of military families to date is that of siblings. In fact, demographic research shows that despite declines in fertility nationwide, more than 80% of youth grow up with at least one sibling in their household. And among military personnel, the average number of siblings number of offspring was 2.0, which is greater than the 1.8 in the general population. Importantly, research with community samples demonstrates that the quality of children and adolescent sibling relationships are uniquely associated to their individual adjustment above and beyond the effects of parenting and other shared environments. For example, researchers found that sibling negativity in middle childhood and adolescence, including conflict, aggression, coercive exchanges, was associated with concurrent and later externalizing problems, including deviance, bullying, and substance use. And a smaller body of work shows that positive sibling relationship qualities such as warmth, intimacy, and support are protective for youth adjustment. Research with military families has generally failed to consider how sibling relationships may affect their adjustment and development. On the one hand, consistent with family systems theories, the negative implications of deployment of a non-deployed parent's mental health and parenting may spill over to the sibling relationship, yielding more problematic dynamics. Accordingly, sibling relationship dynamics may become more problematic themselves, diminish warmth, increase conflict following a parent's deployment. On the other hand, consistent with social provision theory, siblings may turn to each other to compensate for aspects of companionship, support, and intimacy that may be missing from the relationship with the deployed parent. In fact, consistent with this notion, compensation dynamics, evidence for compensation dynamics largely comes from stressed or at-risk families. Therefore, sibling relationships could become more positive following a parent's deployment. And in the one longitudinal study of sibling relationships that followed National Guard families that we conducted, found that youth sibling relationships became more consistent with the former proposition, became less harmonious during the period in which a parent was deployed. That is, we saw that sibling conflict increased slightly during the periods of integration or during the periods of deployment, and then decreased following reintegration, whereas sibling warmth declined over time. If we map these two as a ratio, we think of conflict and warmth together as a quality. We found that over time, so this black line at the top shows that a conflict increased relative to warmth over time, but it generally returned to pre-deployment levels by the following reintegration. Importantly, in this study, we were able to compare this change to siblings from National Guard families that were alerted to a potential deployment that was ultimately canceled. And as you can see here, the patterns of change were different over time, whereas those who experienced a deployment did have this increased disharmony in the relationship versus those who were alerted to a deployment but didn't actually experience it. Importantly, these changes in sibling relationship qualities were related to changes in children's adjustment, such that greater disharmony was associated with greater maladjustment above and beyond at-home parents' depressive symptoms and responsiveness. So sibling relationships have a unique impact on children's development. These findings suggest that the period in which their service member is deployed may be especially difficult as multiple family relationships become strained. Although the association between sibling disharmony and youth adjustment points to the sibling relationship as an additional risk factor for youth adjustment during these transition periods, the associations also suggest that sibling relationships can be leveraged as protective factors that promote resilience. That is, more positive sibling relationships were linked to fewer adjustment problems. Therefore, if we can intervene and promote more positive sibling relationships, we may be able to promote greater resilience. This finding, combined with other work, suggests that siblings often turn to each other to compensate for low levels of support from parents, signals that sibling relationships are a logical target for family-based interventions aimed at promoting resilience amongst all youth, but especially military families. And again, here are the statistics that support those suggestions. So, in conclusion here, we see that different mechanisms are responsible for the links between deployment and children's adjustment. But we'd like to return back to our quiz from earlier about what is evident for children from military families. So our first question was true or false. Do children from military families have higher rates of adjustment problems than children from the community? In general, this is true. They are exposed to more types of stressors, but it is important to note that meta-analyses suggest that these differences in adjustment are relatively small. So it is true, but the magnitude of effect may not be large. Do children from military families demonstrate poor adjustment because of authoritarian military discipline? No. Our results on the mechanisms linking deployments to children's health do not suggest of that. Responsiveness actually is a more important factor, and attachment is an important factor. Do children from military families generally show positive growth following a parent's deployment? Although the opportunity is there, the evidence is not necessarily in support that children are, in general, showing some evidence of a challenge during this period. Maybe the growth will occur later as they enter early adulthood when they've been exposed to these stressors and have more ability to react and cope with challenges later in life. And finally, do children from military families, the quality of the at-home parenting is what determines adjustment during deployments? Yes, that and other family systems. So it is the impact of the deployment on the family system that is key and important and critical in shaping children's adjustment. So key takeaways here beyond the quote or beyond the quiz: military deployments shape at-home parents and children's well-beings. In many cases, the effects of individual deployments are short-lived. Children's exposures to military-connected challenges can accumulate, however. And the effects of deployment may vary across the various stages of the deployment cycle, whether it's during the active deployment or reintegration. And finally, the entire family system contributes to children's well-being. During deployments, at-home parents' behavior is especially important. So with that, I will turn this over to my colleague, Shelley, who will take us forward.
I want to, whoops, I lost the slides. I assume they'll come back. This is timely, actually, because I did want to tell you that Sean and Leanne and I are all involved in a study called Operation Military Experience. And we hope to check on the long-term well-being or the long-term consequences of parental separation for military kids. And we have just completed, Sean doesn't even know this yet, we have just completed wave 1 data collection. We have over 900 families in the study, And we're interviewing moms, dads, and two kids, up to two kids, twice. And we finished the first round of interviews. And early in the spring, we're going to start trying to figure out the beginnings of what these data have to tell us. And we hope to be done data collection by the end of the spring. So stay tuned. These kids are all pre-adolescent or adolescents now, and they were separated for a lengthy period from a parent due to a military deployment prior to age 6. So we're going to see what we learned from that. But now we want to learn a little more from you. And so I'm curious about, I'm sorry, I skipped a slide. I'm curious first about what you've heard and how it resonates with you. Is it not consistent with your experience? Are there particular parts of it that seem especially relevant to the kids and families that you work with? Just what are your thoughts? What sticks out to you? I'm going to advance the slide while you type, but I'm interested in your thoughts, certainly. Oh, thanks, Leanne, for typing that in the notes. My job in our last few minutes is to try to provide an orientation to resources and tools. And I know that the OneOp folks will provide a list of suggestions that we've offered or links to useful resources for you. But I wanted to offer just a little bit of orientation for you that I hope will be helpful to you. So many of you might have seen this before. We call it the protractor model, but I think it's very important in the military space. So you can see around the outside of this diagram the words promotion, prevention, treatment, and maintenance. And what this reflects, of course, is the needs that we might find in the population, both for medical care related to illnesses or disorders, but also to mental health care. And the very important thing is that it starts at the far left with promotion, meaning efforts to educate people about challenges they might face, build their resilience, help equip them for those challenges. And promotion precedes prevention. And you can see that there are different kinds of prevention: universal prevention, selective prevention, indicated prevention. Selective prevention, an example, of course, would be education specifically related to family separation or deployment that gets offered in the military space. But the other reason this protractor model is so important is that in the military space, family-related activities and child-related activities related to prevention tend to live in one stovepipe, if you will, and treatment and maintenance live in a different stovepipe. And there's been so much work in the last 20 years to try to unify, align, harmonize, integrate work done by the Defense Health System, now led by the Defense Health Agency, and the various kinds of family programs. But there's still a lot of stovetyping because resilience lives in one place and transitions live in a different place and so on. So it's always very hard to hold the whole thing together. But I think it's very important as professionals for us all to understand that we are part of a continuum of care, and our job is to try to really help families do as well as possible, but always to be willing and able and knowledgeable about how to refer them to a higher level of care if needed, but also to make sure that the left side of the protractor is as robust and active as the right side. So I think this is such a great orientation for us all to keep in mind as we try to work with these families. I'm going to invite you to, again, enter in the chat your thoughts about these questions, and we can come back to them perhaps during Q&A, but I'm going to cover just a couple more things and then we'll open it up. I wanted to build on what Sean said by making it very concrete. And so at the left in the purple boxes are the kinds of things that Sean was talking about as potential negative influences, if you will, or challenges for families and kids. So parental mental health issues, child maltreatment, illnesses, wounds, and injuries, and of course, loss and bereavement. The good news is there are lots of ways to intervene. And if you're a fan of family systems theory, you know that intervening in one part of the family can actually have consequences throughout the family. So there are many ways to get to good outcomes. And so what you can see here are different intervention strategies that tackle different parts of the family and work on activating different resilience processes. So with individuals, we might focus on treating symptoms, and cognitive behavioral therapy has been shown to be quite helpful with things such as post-traumatic stress, for example, or sleep disorders, both of which can really interfere with relationships with spouses and children. In parent-child relationships, Sean talked a lot about parental responsiveness, parenting practices, and the ADAPT program developed by Abby Gewirtz has been shown to be very effective with school-age children and adolescents. The FOCUS program for early childhood has been shown to be very effective with younger children. It's such an important point here that independent to some extent or distinct from parental mental health issues are parenting practices. So even if a parent is depressed, for example, or has PTSD, if they can maintain their responsiveness and their sensitivity to their child, they will be able to maximize positive outcomes for their child. For couples and communication skills, the Strong Bonds program, which is a marriage enrichment program that the chaplains tend to run, has been shown to be very helpful. And Project Focus, again, has a couples module. And at the family level, for example, working on problem solving, Focus for couples and families has been shown to be effective. All of these are accessible to military families in one way or another, and perhaps they will be useful resources for you to refer to. There are a couple more questions here. I'm going to just page through them and invite you to contribute to the chat. But also, we want to get to Q&A, so you may have things that you would like to answer there or ask there, I'm sorry. So let me invite Rachel to direct us about how she would like to handle some questions and discussion. And I want to thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you. Yes, at this time, we want to go ahead and open up questions or comments that you may have for any of the presenters. What we'll do is as you type them in, I'm going to read them out loud, and then any of the presenters can go ahead and respond at that point. So our first question that's come through is, how do we get to resources regarding grief?
Yeah, grief is a really tough topic, and I'll just suggest what comes to my mind off the top of my head, and then invite the other speakers to jump in. The first place that I think to go is the Tragedy Assistance Program for Survivors. They work with thousands and thousands of survivors, military-connected survivors of both war-related injuries as well as suicide and other forms of loss. And I think have worked closely with scientists who are experts about this. And then the other place that I would look is the work of Steve Koza at the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences. Steve has built quite a record of research focused especially on traumatic grief that people kind of get stuck in and requires a different approach than other kinds of grief. But Leanne or Sean, is there anything you'd like to add in thinking about grief?
Unfortunately, I don't have additional suggestions.
One thing I would throw in is the National Military Family Bereavement Study, which links to the work that Steve Koza is doing at the Center for the Study of Traumatic Stress at Uniformed Services University. Their study is ongoing, but they have a nice page of links with bereavement support. TAPS is included, as Shelley mentioned, and some others as well. So I can put the link to that in the chat.
Great, thank you, Leanne. Rachel, I saw some questions go by in chat. Do you want to choose what you want us to answer? Do you want me to troll through? What's your preference?
I can happily go to the next question that someone posed,
Okay.
and it's how can providers stay up to date on or access research, especially when they might not have access to a database?
This is such a great question, and I am so happy that you asked. I'll jump in, and again, if Leanne and Sean want to add anything, please feel free. So, given that we are on a OneOp platform, I think I would be very remiss if I failed to mention Military Reach, which is also part of the USDA DoD partnership. It's located at Auburn University, and our good colleagues, Mallory Lucier-Greer and Katie O'Neill, lead REACH. And the REACH folks maintain an active search in the literature every month, and they do summaries of research for professional audiences. They do 12 a month. They're called trip reports. And they have a searchable database of all the trip reports that they've done. They have a newsletter that you can join, so you'll get an email every month with a link to that month's trip reports. OneOp, of course, through all of its webinars and its connections with experts, brings you research in a digestible way. But the other thing I want to mention is an initiative that my institute, the Military Family Research Institute, does in partnership with REACH, which is called the Thompson. It began as the Barbara Thompson Award for Excellence in Research on Military and Veteran Families. We're now just calling the whole initiative the Thompson. And the Thompson Initiative includes the award, which will be given December 9th in DC. And there will be a streaming session where you can hear the winner of the award speak, as well as the finalists for the award. This is an award that you can't apply for. Researchers have no idea they're being considered. It's a very rigorous process. In November, I'll be announcing the finalists for the award. And we also are now beginning to publish the Thompson list, which is the best of the best studies of the year. This year, there are 11. And Military Reach does summaries of all the Thompson studies. So the Thompson competition every year identifies the best of the best. Military Reach prepares the summaries of them, and both of those things are accessible to you regardless of whether you have access to a database or not.
One other resource I'd love to mention is the Penn State Clearinghouse for Military Family Readiness, which is an initiative that culls the research that's been done on particular programs and provides reviews of those programs so that it's apparent what the efficacy of those programs are. That database is open to the public as well, and I will drop the link into the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Wadsworth and Dr. Knobloch. Kind of going back, you mentioned Military OneSource, and an individual asked, is Military OneSource open to all of these populations, especially regarding counseling services when needed?
I may not have the up-to-the-minute answer. Certainly, anybody can go to the OneSource website and you can look up all kinds of stuff. The counseling services, I know, obviously are available to active component folks anytime. And I believe it doesn't have to necessarily be the service member who initiates contact. I don't know what the current rule is with regard to reserve component folks. I know they can access it when they're activated, but I think they're able to access it even when they're not activated. And the rules about the counseling historically have been pretty generous, like a certain number of sessions per problem per year. I have not reviewed the rules recently, so it's possible they've changed. And of course, I don't know what the shutdown has produced. There may be folks on the call who know better than I, but I know they've worked hard to try to make it as accessible as they can.
Thank you, Dr. Wadsworth. Kind of going along the lines of your grief resources, this is a little bit different though. An individual was wondering about resources regarding ambiguous loss and grief. So sometimes the person who comes home isn't necessarily the same person who left. And so there's going to be this grief in that too, but it can be very few resources to support those individuals. Do you happen to have any suggestions or ideas?
Yeah, this is a really common issue. And this term ambiguous loss is often attributed to Pauline Boss uh, from Minnesota, who was trained in family systems theory and family stress theory, and developed this idea that uh, it's so difficult. For example, after 9/11, many families didn't have a body to bury, and it's true in military families too. And so you have someone who's physically present, perhaps, but kind of psychologically absent, such as someone who is kind of mired in grief or PTSD and can't really engage with the rest of the family, or they're just really different. You can have people who are physically absent, like during a deployment, but psychologically very present. Children, for example, worry very much about the safety of their military parent. And dangerous deployments are not limited to combat. Deployment for natural disasters, for example, can be very dangerous, or peacekeeping can be very dangerous. So this ambiguity is very stressful and difficult. So Pauline Boss has written about that quite a bit. Steve Koza deals with it, I think, quite a bit. And those would probably be the places that I would start.
Thank you,
I'd
Dr.
also
Wadsworth. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say I dropped a PDF in the chat from Pauline Boss's work that provides specific recommendations for dealing with grief as a function of ambiguous loss. That handout talks about things like practicing self-care, seeking support, acknowledging and validating feelings, adopting both and thinking, which is the process of holding more than one experience true in your mind, focusing on what you can control, and practicing patience and adaptation. So there might be something in that resource that might be useful to folks on the call. Thanks.
Great. Thank you both for sharing all those resources. At this time, we're getting close to the end of the session, so we have about 7 minutes left. I do want to give a shout out to our three presenters, Dr. Wadsworth, Dr. Whiteman, and Dr. Knobloch, for sharing your expertise. And the content throughout today was very rich, lots of resources. So I hope participants are able to gather a lot of those resources that have come through the chat as well. At this time, I would like to shift a little bit and kind of go over our continuing education credit hours, because I know several of you are interested in that information. And since we're getting close to the end, I want to briefly go over that with you. So this webinar is approved for 1.5 continuing education credits. So whether you're a certified patient advocate, a case manager, a family and consumer sciences professional, or a certified family life educator, those early interventionists that are on, human resource professionals, social workers, licensed professional counselors, licensed marriage and family therapists, there are CEs for you here after today's session. And then those of you that are just interested in a certificate of attendance to maybe provide to your supervisor or just showing that you attended today, certificates of attendance are also available. But please note, you will, no matter if it's a CE credit or just a certificate of attendance, you will need to complete a brief survey. You are going to be able to find a link to our survey on our event webpage where you've downloaded the slides, where you've registered for today's event, where you've learned a little bit more about the content for today's presentation. You're also going to see a section towards the very end of the website that's Continue Education. And then you're going to see a nice purple button saying Continue Education. You might have to refresh your website or give us a few minutes if it's not popping up right away on your site. That Continue Education purple button will appear. You will go through a survey. Make sure you follow all those survey questions carefully. You will then be sent to a page where you identify which CE or certificate of attendance you're looking for. And then once you complete those necessary requirements, you should receive an automatically generated email certificate. If you have any questions, if you're having any issues, any tech issues with accessing the CE site, or if you are just unable to receive your emailed certificate, my colleague Amy Smith just posted in the chat, our contact is ce@oneop.org. Shoot us an email. We're happy to help you and provide any assistance with getting those CEs and certificates to you. Also, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our next upcoming event, which is just right around the corner. It's October 23rd at 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Join us for a webinar from Clicks to Consequences, Understanding Youth Online Sexual Behavior. And so in this didactic presentation, we're going to explore some of the pathways by which youth encounter sexual media online and the subsequent effects on their social and emotional health. And so considerations for military-connected youth experiences are going to be included in this presentation. And the presenters are also going to introduce some various therapeutic techniques to address online problematic sexual behavior and empower providers and clinicians to address these topics in their work with children and families. So please join us. I know that's just right around the corner, happening this week. I'm going to go ahead and post that information to get registered for that event. That's happening on the 23rd. So CE credit will be available. So I know that's always important for everyone that's on. And then for all other items, just get connected with OneOp to explore any upcoming events, articles, resources, and more. We have lots of upcoming events, lots of webinars on demand, learning opportunities, as well as online courses, especially for those providers that are needing continuing education credit hours. We are offering all free CE offerings, so get connected at oneop.org to learn a little bit more. At this time, we are going to hang on so you can get any last minute resources and links that are in the chat. And let me see if there was any questions that I may have missed. I don't know if this is something that our presenters can answer or not, but there was a question from Alan in the chat regarding has there been any feedback from military families on the changing of the working department title from Department of Defense to Department of War, if you've heard anything. And I don't know if the presenters can answer that or not, but just wanted to make note that we did see that in the chat.
Yeah, I've not heard anything from military families themselves. I think in the nonprofit community and advocacy organizations, I think there's just a lot of I don't know, uncertainty about what language to use, given that it's kind of a fully legal change and it's kind of not, so people aren't exactly sure. They're really not sure what to do, I think, but I've not heard anything in any great amount from families. I suspect listeners may have heard more than I have.
Thank you, Dr. Wadsworth. All right, we are going to begin closing out because we have reached the end of today's session. Thank you all for joining us today. Please get connected with oneop.org. A big shout out to our 3 presenters today for a wonderful, informative session. We appreciate you sharing your expertise with all of us. And to the participants, we hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you all.